Hi everyone, welcome back to First Principles. Today we have repeat quest. How you doing, Ashish?
Good, good. How are you doing, sir?
Very well. I know you've done this before, but can you introduce yourself again, please?
Hey, my name is Ashish Tripathi. I'm associate director of product at Analect, which is an Omnicom company. And I am on LinkedIn. I write articles about product management, and I also make nerdy Etsy product management shirts for anybody who's interested in those too. So yeah, that's pretty much an introduction of myself. I've had 15 years in product. So I'm really interested and enthusiastic about product management in general. And yeah, that's what I like to discuss and talk about with you. So that's
Yeah. Oh, in the context of this episode, I guess we'd be focusing on user stories, user story mapping, and I also want to get in some older terms like just requirements and requirement solicitation. So let me just ask you, just to start off with, uh, the difference between requirements and user stories. I mean, like how do you approach it?
sure, sure. I mean, so I think really the main kind of impetus that started people changing how they did requirements into user stories kind of started in the difference between the traditional waterfall software development cycle versus agile. And so when I first started my career as a software developer for Boeing and for the International Space Station, everything there was done via the waterfall process, right? And the software development cycles were where you had requirements and there were contractual obligations and money related to requirements. So in that way, and I think in some ways, a lot of people don't there I don't think that there is no value in a waterfall project because there's definitely value in terms of tracking tracking spend and fixed cost projects. I think there's definitely a value in saying like these are the requirements that we will complete and I will pay you once these requirements are met, right? And
Right.
if you need to change the requirements, it's because of this, this, and this, and then but so where the inefficiency comes with those kinds of requirements is that once you have a list of requirements, you can spend, and at least in my own experience, I found you can spend multiple hours trying to determine the language of requirements,
Mm.
getting very detailed into the minutia of what does it mean to deliver the functionality that's in a requirement and the interpretation of a requirement, right? Is very closely intertwined in the language of how that requirement is written,
Right.
right? And whereas a user story is and I will say this about product managers now that's now so user stories are kind of introduced in the agile framework and the real difference between in my mind of a user story is that you really are and you really should tell a story, right? So like product managers, if anything, are really storytellers,
Mm.
right? And they should be telling stories of the problems that users are having and how the product is going to solve that problem, right?
Right.
So in some ways, a user story is a little more loose than what you would have in a requirement. And generally, I actually write user stories in a more ambiguous fashion than maybe people like them to be because I believe that a user story is an invitation to a conversation and should be written in a way that lets the decisions, the creative decisions, stay in the developers and the UI UXers and the QA's minds versus myself dictating what those solutions should be,
Hmm.
right? Like now I might have an opinion on whether the solution is actually gonna work, whether it will like satisfy the user, because I might be closer to the user and speaking to the user in a more um and the stakeholders more than say like the developer would be or a QA would be.
Yeah.
But I don't want to limit the creativity of the developers, the development team. And so in this, it's inclusive of UX, UI, and developers and QA, by defining what the solution will be, right? So really what I'm doing is I'm defining the problem
Yeah.
and what I want uh to solve versus like how to solve it. The
Right.
how is decided by the user, and so by the team, right? In general. And so we're all supposed to work on it collaboratively together. Um so yeah, so I think, I think when I was a developer, in a lot of ways it's much easier, and I think even coming up in school it's much easier to work in a waterfall methodology because you have a checklist, you go through the checklist, you finish it, right? Like, and then you turn it in, and that's when you get graded, right?
Yeah.
In this way, and Agile is trying to do this, right? Because part of the value of Agile and software development, like not just Agile in general, but like the way that like Scrum goes, and the generally Scrum and Kanban, you have a little bit less of this, and there's a little bit different
Hmm.
reasonings for Kanban. But Scrum, part of the value. I mean, I think you get a little bit of this, but part of the value of Agile and Kanban Scrum is that it's really around giving the autonomy to the developers, right? And so in some ways, this gets lost a lot of the time. Um, because part of it is to say like one of the aspects of autonomy that you're supposed to get, and this is really more to satisfy the developers in the long term. so
Yeah.
so I would even argue that like you might like it better. Like if you're a new developer and I come in and I say like, "Hey, I'm gonna write this user story like completely ambiguous because I want you to think about it," right?
Yeah.
Like as a QA and as a developer, at your first initial reaction might be like, "What the hell? Like just tell me what you want me to do. Like I just want to know what to do so I can go off and do it and not have to like interact with everyone." Which would actually be like potentially easier.
Hmm.
However, I don't think you get a higher quality product, and you won't be happy in the long run because eventually you'll say, "Oh, well, I have no autonomy. I have no like creativity in like what I'm doing at work." And every day I come in and, Ashish tells me what to do and I just go and do it, right? And so it's kind of it's one of these things that in the long term I think is more valuable
Yeah.
than it is in the short term of how requirements are. And so yeah, and so that's kind of the value there. But then you also get, because you have this short turnaround on user stories and you have this ambiguity, there is actually a value to the customer as well,
Hmm.
because you have the capability to test quickly and you don't spend the time you would have spent on refining the requirements from a contractual basis
Hmm.
that you would have had when that time gets used into developing and refining the actual requirements themselves
Yeah.
rather than the language of the requirement, right? And so like, so that's really, because like that's really what I would find you would waste tons of hours on, right? Is like you would say like, hey, we've delivered these 10 requirements, and you go and look at them. And this happens all the time. Like if you've ever run a fixed cost project in your house, right? Like this is the same kind of thing that can happen. Like you
Yeah.
remodel the kitchen and you say like, oh, like I just want plugs in the kitchen. Then there might be a cost increase because you didn't get GDF plugs, and then the guy would say, well, of course you needed GDF plugs because this is a bath, this is a kitchen, and there's water nearby, so
Yeah.
only like, and so in these cases, like you guys could argue, or like you could say like, hey, I wanted it gray, and it's like if you don't give the exact color and they just put like the cheapest gray,
Hmm.
then or like and it doesn't have a gloss or something like that, like, right, like those are the kinds of issues that can creep up in a waterfall world, in a requirements world,
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily happen in agile or user story world, right? Like,
Okay. I want to spend some more time over here with requirements here because
yeah,
the, the costs are going to be involved anyway, even if we are taking the agile route, right? And
yeah,
somebody who's very cost conscious, that might be a problem for them. Like,
sure.
so how do you tackle that?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like that extra time that you would have spent, like, so I think that the different, so it's either time or money, right? Like when you think about like a project, right?
Right.
So and so this is where it kind of comes out, right? That if you can spend that extra time debating on the requirement, right? But then the difference is the value that you get is that you get something available first,
Hmm.
and then so you would see the great, because sometimes too, like let's say I pick like if we take the kitchen remodeling example again, I was very careful in my requirements writing, and I said I wanted this very specific color, right?
Yeah.
And I put the color code in, and I said like I want this brand of paint, and this was the color, and I went and they painted the whole thing gray. Well, let's say they painted the whole thing gray. Like
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend doing this. I would recommend like getting a sample and maybe doing one portion of it first in gray. But let's say they did paint the whole thing in gray.
Hmm.
And then when I go and look at it, the sunlight, the way that the sunlight comes into the room, because I didn't, consider, the shadows that would get created from the windows when the sunlight comes in.
Hmm.
It's a much darker gray than I had like initially anticipated, right? Now, the difference between, say, an agile approach would be, yeah, in an agile approach, you would maybe just do one piece gray, see if the user liked that piece is gray, and then say like, well, this is the gray that you asked for, and you could say like, okay, yeah, it is looking the way that I imagined, or it's
Yeah.
not looking the way that you could do one wall that's gray, or do some samples of gray. And oftentimes, when you buy paint, people will suggest doing this, right? Like
Yeah.
to buy a little sample of the paint and then go in and paint the wall, like the different samples that you'd like. So it's a similar idea, right? That like what you get in the agile world, even though it may seem like it takes or takes more time, what I would say you get that savings by being able to quickly adapt to like the change rather than an iteratively change versus like changing the whole thing like from the start.
And is this only valid for low capital projects or for any kind of project? So you can use this approach anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think so in the sense that because this does come up often, right? Like
Hmm.
if you've got like a medical device or something like that, right? Like, there's so much time that you have to spend in like, certification. And the same thing is true with aerospace, right? I mean,
Hmm.
obviously, like, right, like you've got like tons of time that you have to spend in aerospace with the certification and the requirements and things like that. But I would even argue that some of those things and some of the reasons why SpaceX and stuff are more successful
Hmm.
is because of being able to kind of quickly like change the requirements in the same sense, right? Like
Right.
do a test, Like if you look at the rockets and like like they blew up tons of rockets, right? And they were just like whatever, it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right? And so that's like so I think it there are spaces for it. It's just the turnaround time may be longer than what you had normally done. And I do ultimately believe you get to a better product by it. But if you are like super like, price conscious and looking at it, then, that's really where like the MVP kind of is more important, right? And having someone who can understand the customers and being like, okay, what are they really willing to pay for? Where's the actual real value in this
Hmm.
to the customer is really kind of more important, right? Like because if you build something that's not if you build something that's not doesn't solve somebody's problem, I don't know if you're oftentimes always going to be able to make a profit, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, so like, yeah, I mean, I think there's something there too. Like, there's oftentimes like, there's oftentimes like, it's almost like mm, there's like this idea of like the shitification of like software products, right? And I think there is a little bit of that, right? Like
Hmm.
in a lot of ways. Like a lot of times some of the apps and some of the products that come out are actually awesome. And then they're totally solving like somebody's problem,
Yeah.
right? Like being able to connect or being able to communicate or do something artistic or something
Hmm.
like that. And then you know like after the growth and they're at a lot, they're like they're operating at a loss, like the startup is operating at a loss. And it isn't until they're like, oh well, now that we've got the growth of like 50 billion people, now we want to we want to make money off of it. And then the attempts to make money off of it make it like less uh
Valuable.
valuable to the people who initially used it, right? And so
Hmm.
then people switch platforms, right? Or like people don't use that product anymore. And you see this all the time. I mean, you see this all the time. Like
Right.
that's why there's certain things that are trending on like social media and whatever else, right? Like it's because of this, right? And so I think ultimately, as long as you're really solving someone's problem, and I think the products that actually do kind of endure without like becoming worse over time are the ones that really do solve a need of the customer that's out there, right?
And user
Yeah.
stories, you're saying, is a better mechanism than the old school requirement elicitation and gathering in order to satisfy this kind of demand.
I think it can be because it's definitely you're iteratively changing over time. And I also believe that sometimes the design isn't isn't going to respond in the way that you think it will
Hmm.
when it actually gets into the hands of the users.
Right.
Like
Right.
I know that for sure, like through experience, right? Like there have been multiple times when I was like, oh yeah, everyone's gonna love this feature, and nobody used it, right? Like they were just like they're like this was confusing, and then I would refine that capability, but sometimes there would be cases where you have to be like, okay, well, like let's just completely redesign this because like
Right.
it's not worth it, or even like there was times when we came up with A/B tests, and I would be like really excited about one of the options that's in an A/B test,
Hmm.
and we would run the test, and nobody like used it, right? The other option worked like way better than the other. And it's just because sometimes you don't realize like that's not how some people are going to use it, right? Like you just don't know until people actually like are are working in their like normal day to day that's how they're gonna use the application, right?
Right.
Like even if you look at like Clubhouse, right? Like I think the concept is like amazing, right?
Hmm.
Like oh yeah, like a non-visual like social media, like great, you know? But then you can see that like I don't know, people kind of like stop using it after COVID, right?
Yeah.
Like cuz it's just not as like, I don't know. So anyway, like I'm not trying to pick on Clubhouse, but I just think that like just think that there's sometimes you just don't know why something is going to catch on and become like viral, and then become a hit, and then sometimes you don't know why something won't, and so that's kind of until it's out there in the wild and people are using it.
So are user stories then replacing requirements, or is this just an added layer where requirements can be derived on an individual basis?
Yeah, I think it's really more just a different way to look at requirements,
Right.
right? Because it's the requirements, and this is the other thing that I try to avoid with the ambiguity inside the user story, because
Hmm.
what you don't want to happen is that you're just doing waterfall for 2 weeks,
Hmm.
right? Like that's really what you want to avoid, like in agile, right? Like it shouldn't be that I come into planning and refinement, and then everyone just listens to me or the tech lead and then goes off and does their thing, and then we don't talk again until the end of the sprint. That
Yeah.
like in my mind, the ideal situation is that we're talking all the time,
Hmm.
right? Like we're talking, like I'm talking to, definitely every day at the stand up, but then after the stand up, if someone's like, hey, I've got a blocker, I've got some confusion on the way that this thing is coming out, or like I wanted to take it by you to see if it's like the way that you initially expected, or I want to take it by you in UI UX to see if like, because like they're like those are the things that, like, not only like that, the reason why that ambiguity should be there is so that like we can resolve that like at the time. And so then you get more of a collaborative effort, like when you're creating the product, right? So like I think in some ways it's like, because there are sometimes like when I'm creating like internal tools or something, I can be like, sometimes there are cases where I could actually get the actual user, right, and just be like, oh well, let me take this by the let me take this initial design by the user, right? Or
Yeah.
let's show this and see if like it will work out, and like, they'll be able to come back and say like, yeah, that will work before we've even like spend even more money to implement it, right? Like the whole idea is like there's some efficiency that gets gathered by like being interactive like during the development versus like go off and do the development and then come back and bring the product to market, right? Versus like you're iteratively bringing like you're iteratively changing the product as you're like as people are using it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. On an individual developer level, then, is it, how do I put this? Is it, are we telling them to give us this outcome and they can figure out how? And of course, if they need help, of course, there's a tech lead and all of those people.
Yeah.
But then, what about certain ways to write code, right? In a proper way, if you are into test-driven development, and that is an inherent requirement, and QAs come in over there. Or for that matter, if you want to purchase some web server or whatever, this guy prefers Azure, this guy prefers, AWS. Is What are the guardrails against that kind of chaos? Or if you have experienced that
Yeah,
before.
yeah, no, it's a valid question. I mean, I think there are guardrails around like the software development,
Hmm.
like, how you do software development, right?
Right.
Like, and even like how you test, right? Like, do I think there are certain ways that work better than others? Like for
Hmm.
sure,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Um, and you just like, I mean, just to mention, like, normally, like, I think like you should have a very good regression suite that runs, like, and you should have some sort of smoke test that runs whenever somebody checks in the code so that
Yeah.
you could say like, hey, you didn't break it enough to like stop the person from purchasing, or
Right.
whatever the goal is of the activity, right?
Hmm.
Like I think there should be like those kinds of things that I think those make sense. I also think when you're deploying it, like having like a canary system or something that like progressively puts out the requirements versus like giving it to the population at large is
Yeah.
is often, um, ideal. But there, even if you don't have the ideals, I think there are ways that you can kind of get around it, like just by understanding that, like, hey, we probably should have some user testing with this and make sure that it like works like before we, go user acceptance testing before we go to a large group, or like, have this big bang, change that like will startle everyone. Um, and I think that's really the other thing too that I think is useful, right? Like, because most of the time people don't want a large change,
Hmm.
right? Like, especially if it's something that they're using before, like a lot, or even something that they're used to, like, because I would say, like, even if you like if you start creating a spreadsheet, like, and I think this is kind of some of the issues with, like, like if you start creating a table that has columns and rows, people are going to think of spreadsheets, right?
Yeah.
Like, they're going to think of Microsoft Excel sheets, and there's nothing you could do about it to be like, and they're going to say like, well, why can't I just tab to the next cell? Like, that's what I want to be able to do, right?
Yeah.
And it's because like people are used to that capability, right?
Hmm.
Like, and in their mind they've already got a model for it like set up,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I mean, I don't think it goes as far as going like where like Plato has like the ideal forms, and like
Hmm.
I don't think people have like a table thought of like as an ideal form of the
Yeah.
thing, but I think there is something of like a familiarity, right? Like when you're used to something that is like it, then it better kind of work that way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, like, and so definitely when the other advantage of having like an iterative approach or like an agile approach to stuff is that and I would recommend this for most of the products, is that like you slowly introduce the changes over time, and then people kind of see them, because there is some frustration that comes out of like onboarding something like brand new,
Hmm.
like I don't know about you, but if you've ever updated like Windows, like that is like the worst experience like in my life, right? Like like I hate it, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it's and then eventually I'll get used to it over time, right? Like, but it's like there's also been like other products that have just like you know, completely failed after like a new, UI revamp, right? And
Yeah.
it's like it's because people don't like the change, right? Like
Yeah.
like you've got to kind of slowly do it, or you've got to make the change in a way that they either value it so much that they want to change, or that it's slow, like, or the onboarding of it is nice enough that it doesn't feel like much of a change, or it's still intuitive.
Yeah. Very
So
few people are going to be just, in that famous graph where talk about adoption. Very few people over there. So people want, and it's not just like the conservative, let's say, ethic that people have, that they just are used to a certain thing. It has real consequences. I mean, these things are like, for their utility value, they're introducing friction. So if a
hmm
new UI comes in, I'll have to learn, and I might not want to do that. So that it's a good element to listen. Okay. I have one last question before we move on to user
yeah, yeah.
stories. How in the waterfall world, and I'm sure a good case can be made for the continuation of those kind of projects, but how let's how do I want to put this? How atomic are the requirements there? Like, are they very well fleshed out, or there's ambiguity there as well?
In requirements versus you're talking about in the waterfall
In the waterfall,
world.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience of it, right, like they were very well fleshed out,
Hmm,
right? Like there were hours, and not only that, but changes
hmm,
were all tracked and, version controlled, and even I mean, to the point of like where the software itself right? Like the number of lines that were changed per like change in requirement were tracked,
Yeah.
right? So that it was very like detailed on like, now obviously like, is this because it's a government contract and like things like that? Like, yeah, probably, right? Like, do I think there is a world where waterfall requirements are more vague? And yeah, I do. But I think there's also probably a lot more litigation and like things that happen like in those worlds,
Yeah.
like after it's delivered, or unhappy customers after it's delivered, right?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't exactly what it was. Um, and then I think I do also think that there is a world of like subjectivity too, right? Like of like where you can kind of like give like I would think that like an interior designer or something, right? Like, maybe like like if you're like, let's say you're hiring an interior designer to redo your kitchen, there's probably some sort of sense of ambiguity in
Yeah.
there, or like sense of like, like, oh, this person will make, like, the reason I'm hiring this person is like to make the decisions for me, right?
Yes.
So it's like, so I think in those cases it's probably less like, like less concrete, or in terms of the requirements. But
Yeah.
in the cases where each requirement, or each change causes a change in money, I think that can be definitely a bigger difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Make the decisions for me till I don't have to pay more. So, that's
Right,
that's what's happening. Okay.
right, right.
User stories. Um, let's actually deconstruct this.
Mhm,
Users and story. Like,
mhm.
give us a give us a definition. I know you have a good definition of what a story should be and constitutes
Yep.
parts of it. But
Yeah,
let's start with
yeah.
users. Who are the users here?
Okay, well, so the users, I do think that you should come up with a persona, and kind of come up with who you think they are, right?
Hmm.
I think there is also another distinction that sometimes the purchaser is not the user, right?
Yeah.
So the person who's actually, maybe buying the tool, and this definitely happens in B2B versus like B2C, right? Where the purchaser is not the person who is actually using the tool.
Yeah.
Um, so in some ways there can be some struggle there, right? Because sometimes you can build a great, and you can have a marketing channel that's great for the actual consumer, like the
Hmm.
purchaser of a product, right? And they'll be like, yeah, this is great. This will make a ton of money for me, or save me a ton of money. But it may cause more heartache on the user, right? Like, so the ideal situation is to have a user that's understand the user and build a product for the user as well as like the purchaser. Like
Hmm.
that's the ideal goal, right?
Right.
And I would say that implementing and having an adoption is probably easier, even if they're not the same person, to find something that will help both of the people, right? The purchaser and the user of the tool, right?
Yeah.
If you can find something that can do both, or you should think about, how does this product, how can I frame this product so that it helps the user just as much as it does. Now, the other difference that I will do typically is, usually you're supposed to come with a persona, which is supposed to be your either your ideal customer, or a current customer.
Hmm.
And it's supposed to be an amalgamation, or like an aggregate of like what the actual user would be, right? Like,
Yeah.
give them the kinds of products and deadline, or problems and deadlines that they normally would have on a day-to-day basis, and like, then how does your product like solve for those people?
Yeah.
But one of the difference that maybe I do is like, I actually like if it's like an internal tool, I'll say who the user is,
Hmm.
right? Like, and I'll be like, oh, you go talk to that user, because that's the person, right? That's gonna actually like use this and like evangelize this for us, right?
Yeah.
Um, so in some ways I'll do that, right? And especially if you have the connection to that person, right? And I think that ultimately gets a better product for the user in that way. But yeah, the user is, really should start with the persona. You should understand that persona. That should be the same persona that you market to,
Hmm.
right? And so if you're like in a niche or in a very niche market, then like you need to understand who that person is, like what makes them tick, what are their problems,
Yeah.
and ultimately, and I think we went through this in like the design thinking too, but ultimately it's like it's to really empathize with that user because you want everyone in the company really to empathize with that user if it's the same user that across all the areas. But even if you're just trying to capture a different user base in the market, like when you're trying to do that, they need to understand who that person is, you know?
Is it always the end user, or can there be intermediary users as well? Like
Yeah,
if you're just
yeah.
doing what's that word? I'm forgetting the word. It's been like a year since I was in not redeployment, refactoring. So when you're
Mhm.
refactoring, is that also going through the user story channel, or is that just a regular, requirements channel?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think part of the user story mapping, you can sometimes find efficiencies that would, maybe not necessarily be the the same user who is the purchaser, right?
Yeah.
But there may be other users. So that's what I mean. Like sometimes the user is not the actual purchaser, and even in a website like that's like an e-commerce website,
Hmm.
right? You may not actually, the user may not be the same person as at the same time as the user that like is purchasing it,
Right.
right? Like, so I do think there is, because you can often see this, like, right, when you have like when you have a sale, like if it isn't a digital product, it's like a physical product, right? Like online,
Hmm.
then you have fulfillment that's fulfilling that sale. So they'll need to use the product as well, right? Like because the order has to be created and then it has to go to them, and then they have to be able to like get the shipping label and then put it all together. These. So there are other users that may come during the user story, and then that's why you need to define who that persona is in a user story, right? Like,
Hmm.
and make sure you know who all the personas are the um the within the system, you know.
Okay. Okay.
But to your point, like there are concepts too of like maybe having a system as a persona as
Hmm.
well, like rather than having like an actual user.
Hmm.
I sometimes think about that, but I often like to be very user centric and like really like because ultimately even in some system somebody is using it somewhere, right? Like it's got to be going, like even if it's a data warehouse, like somebody in that data warehouse is going to use that information later, and so like figure out like who that is and why are they looking at it, right? Like that's
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it can be a super technical, super specialized user, but still a user in that way, and there is a person over there. Um, NVIDIA, I'm sure all the personas were around GPUs and gaming, and then
Mhm.
suddenly AI, Bitcoin, first of all, Bitcoin needed those chips, all the miners, and then AI did it. So, such kind of a radical shift, because, in the wild, anything can happen.
Mhm.
Is
Mhm.
that is that normal, or like they handled it well, I guess, but like any thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I like, like, and that happens, right?
Mm,
Like, I think that happens in business of like, not only like you will try to get, capture that market. So your personas may change,
mm,
right? You
mm.
may be adding personas that into your mix, right? Like like an AI user may be different than, a Bitcoin miner, right? Like, so you want to understand like what is important to them,
Yeah.
and then see like how can we capture that market, right? Like,
Right.
or how can we serve that persona versus like another. So like it is a kind of a constant process, and like, and definitely if you're trying to gather that kind of persona, then it's very important to understand who that person is and who that persona is. And I my opinion of product management is always this, that like marketing should understand who that persona is too,
Yeah.
because that's who, if that's who you're trying to get, then that, like, your message may need to change, right?
Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. I mean, of course, product marketing management kind of is part of product management. Depending on what your company size is and how much resource you want to put, those could be
Yeah.
subtitles of one. Okay.
Mhm.
Stories. What is a story in this, in a very fundamental sense?
Yeah. So story has, generally, and there's different definitions of kind of the elements of a story, but there's typically five elements of a story,
Hmm.
right? And those elements are a setting. So, where is this story taking place?
Hmm.
There's a plot. So like this is really like out of, more than just one thing that a person will do, right? It's more about like where is the entire plot of the story going, right? So it's like what are all the activities that the person may be doing?
Right.
That's really what the plot of a story would be. And then you've got the character. So, you've got generally a person or characters that's involved in it. And then you have a conflict that goes through, and then a theme, conflict, which is, some sort of problem that the character is facing
Yeah.
and must overcome. And then you have a theme. So typically the theme is like, what is the whole story about, right? Like it may not be just one part of it. It might be, an overarching, it's not the individual pieces that happen. It's not the plot. It's maybe an overarching theme that happens across the whole thing. The idea would be like, I don't know if you're a fan of Mighty Python, but there is a skit where they're trying to have a parakeet. He's trying to return a dead parakeet
Hmm.
that back to the store. And so the plot would be, that there's a man, he's trying to go into a store and he's purchased a parakeet and he's trying to return the
Right.
parakeet. But the theme is actually really more around that he's trying to return something that's unreturnable, right?
Right.
Like that and it's so that theme could be used in many multiple different plots, right? Like, and
Hmm.
so multiple different skits of like someone try, or like, comedy skits of somebody trying to return something that's unreturnable, right? Like but that so it doesn't necessarily have to be like a parakeet in a parakeet shop, so this is really like, so that's kind of like the difference of, the theme and the plot,
So once again, there is a context. Did you say what's the first
oh, sorry, there's the setting
setting?
is the first one.
Right.
The second is plot.
Plot. Okay.
The third is character.
Hmm.
The fourth is conflict,
Right.
and the final one is the theme.
Okay. Do you need a hero over here, or could it just be like egalitarian and everybody and there are characters, or it needs to focus on one person's life, or how does that work?
I don't think it has to be like in stories, you don't necessarily have to have it. If you look at like, like if you look at like Joseph Campbell's,
Hmm.
like, he's written, the hero with a thousand faces, which is really more around like how hero stories and stories across cultures all typically have the same elements and the same kind of plot. And this
Right.
was used by George Lucas and in Star Wars. So there's, the elements that Luke goes through are very similar to the elements of the hero's journey or the hero's story, and like, um yeah, as defined by Joseph Campbell. But that all being said, I don't think that it always has to be one person, because obviously I've read other books that aren't necessarily about, a single character,
Hmm.
or even have a hero in
Right.
them, like, and sometimes they're more metaphorical, or sometimes they're talking about generations or generational kind of elements. So I don't think you have to have that in a story, but I do think it
Help.
does yeah, I think it does help in the sense of that that's what people are kind of used to in relating to themselves.
And how did this kind of these rules do you think evolved? Is it just because of human psychology and this is how we respond to narratives and this is how we see it? That's why we anthropomorphize animals and places and houses and food items or whatever.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I probably have a little bit different theories on it and more anamorphization. Like, I think that there is actually probably, more around. But I do think that we do that in general, and I think there is kind of a philosophical element of like, we like I think before we understood like, phenomenon, like, maybe that's why you have like mythologies of gods and goddesses, because then you can say like, oh, I can relate to how the gods will react, and
Right.
how nature is reacting, because I can't explain it. But if I explain it as like a personal relationship, like,
Mm.
oh, Thor is angry and that's why, we have thunder, then it's something that may be easier to explain. And and so, I think ultimately that's where the tradition of story, and even with themes, but I think that's where the traditions of stories come from, right? It's like
Yeah.
the real value of a story is that you're able to relate to the person who's telling you the story, right? And
Yeah.
and it will give you some sort of guidance and understanding that you wouldn't have had if it wasn't in a story. So
Right.
the same information told without a story is, frankly, is boring, and it's not entertaining, because you can't relate to it, right? So
Mm.
I think these general five elements are there. I mean, Joseph Campbell, in the sense of like, doing all this, um, research on all the different cultures, definitely sees a trend of like the hero's journey. This is the way like stories have, organically, come out like throughout time. And so that's, really how it goes there. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm basically thinking it's like there are mathematical equations describing a phenomena, and then there is the narrative element of it. That even if you read like good nonfiction science books or popular explainers, there is somebody they're making somebody into a human, and they're explaining it to us in that way. So, okay, got it. This helps. This is like the underlying framework. Now the user story. That's the last section. How do they come about and what exactly are we doing when we are writing a user story for any kind of developer to work on?
yeah, so typically a user, again, I think that product managers are storytellers,
Mm.
right? And when you're writing a user story, it is a story,
Mm.
right? If you look at, the typical template for a user story, it starts with the character,
Yeah.
right? So it usually says as a persona, and we talked about that. So the user is the character that you're going to.
Yeah.
And it's I want to, and it's what you want to do, and this is the conflict, right? That the person, because they can't do it now, right?
Yeah.
Like, and it's something that they want to do,
Mm.
and then it's so that, and you give a business reason why, and the business reason why is really the theme, right? Like, why are we doing this, right?
Yeah.
Like, do we want to increase revenue? Do we want to, do they want to solve this problem? Do we want to solve this problem for
Mm.
them? So this is really the theme, right? Um, but see, what you'll notice is that you're missing two elements, and these two elements are usually kind of assumed,
Mm.
which is the setting and the plot.
Right.
And so, I think it's important to have a framework that actually defines those two things. And I think you could do those two things by having user story mapping, which is where, I think the premise of today's topic is.
Yeah.
And so really the map gives you more capabilities, right? Like, so if you look at a map, like what are the things that you want to be able to do in a map? Like if you look at your Google Maps,
Hmm.
like what are you actually looking, right? For, right? The first thing is where are you, right? Like now, definitely, right? Like, but if you have a map that doesn't say like you are here, it's much more difficult to like orient yourself and figure
Yeah.
out. But part of having a map is like understanding the first thing that you usually do is try to orient yourself, right? And where are you, right?
Yeah.
Then, and definitely in like Google Maps is like, where are you going? So there's usually a destination, right?
Yeah.
So you're usually somewhere that you're trying to get to that's on the map. And then the third thing, and this is definitely, definitely, if I didn't have it now on Google Maps, I would be, very annoyed. But it's the routes, right? There's
Right.
multiple routes that you can do, right?
Yeah.
And so maps will tell you that too, right? Like of different routes that you could take, if there's, paths or rivers or some type of thing like that. Like,
Yeah.
if you're out in nature. But it gives you the paths that are available, right? So what you get with user story mapping is you combine the user story with a map, and that gives you the ability to see the setting and the plot because you're going to see all the steps that you're going to see the start or where they are and the destination and so you also will give them potentially different routes, and that's really where the user story mapping comes from
From
and
a
comes in.
Sorry. So, you're saying?
Yeah, by combining those two elements together. So you combine your user stories and you combine a map and you get user story mapping, and then the you get all five elements of a story rather than only three that you normally get in just the user story.
And is that enough? Are those enough conditions for someone to take action on it?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, you can take action with just the user story that just has the three elements. But again, it's assumed, right? Like, so I think you have to kind of build the plot and they need to know the whole destination, kind of where they're starting from.
Right.
And they need to know the setting, like where are we, right? Like, what are you in the application? Are you at home? Are you, like where are you? Are you on your phone? Definitely the setting is become more important now in our time. Electrical setting is definitely different. Are you
Yeah.
in AR? So I think where you are and where your setting is makes much more difference too
Hmm.
than it may have had before. But the user story map kind of gives you that more of that context, right? So that when you start working on a user story, you don't need to have your product manager maybe explain all those different pieces to you.
Hmm.
But then the other beauty of it is then you can explain the story to other people as well without having to get that extra context to them, right?
Right.
I think generally, like when I've shown people user story maps, they generally understand it relatively quickly,
Hmm.
and they get it, right? So, um, I think the first step of user story mapping, right, is to really take the task that a user would do all the way from starting to the end,
Hmm.
right, of the task, right? And so you may ask, like how far do you go and how like because you could get like really way too detailed and have like too many individual tasks like, oh, I'm pressing this button and then I
Hmm.
have to press this button and then
Yeah.
and then or like where do you start? Like do you start by like them putting it on the web, like what putting it on the website, merchandising, like starting to put the product into the website, so these are all kind of questions because that it's up to the kind of the product manager or the person that's trying to bring something new to the market of where do they really want to focus on, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
what part are they trying to optimize to understand that customer journey? I would at least start with where the customer finds the product and then purchases it.
Hmm.
That's probably the initial starting point. But I do think that there is value in going, and sometimes in going from the very beginning of like even the product showing up on the website to all the way to the product getting delivered at the person's house, right? Especially
Yeah.
if you're trying to optimize things across the whole procedure, right?
Right.
So I think there's portions of, so it just kind of has to, it depends on like what are you trying to look at, right? Like, are you trying to optimize across the whole company? If you don't have if it's a green field and you don't have all that stuff yet, then maybe you're just trying to get the most customers in, right? Like
Yeah.
versus, or you've outsourced those other pieces of like delivery and product merchandising. So it's kind of up to you
It
on
is,
that side.
but you said that the level of detail about pressing this task and pressing this task, sorry, there's this button. Um,
Yeah.
this can translate into very detailed requirements as well if you want to work like that, because you could perhaps like a product manager could create that kind of a detailed, but like the last mile isn't covered. The technical lead can come in, cover the last mile for a lot of developers, and then they can work on that till they are autonomous enough. So does that kind of melding happen between the waterfall world and the user story world?
I don't necessarily think so. I think you can get over detailed in that, right? Like about the buttons and stuff like that. I would say like the way that I usually go about it is I make the task into like chunks that make sense for the user to do, right?
For the
Like,
user to do. Okay.
yeah, like so it would be like and that they have like the things they have to do to get to the next step
Right.
versus like things that are optional or kind of like not necessary, then like that those might not be there. And part of the thing is like once you have the steps will usually stay the same,
Hmm.
and the user story mapping comes with creating underneath the steps the user stories that might make that step more efficient or what you're going to change.
Right.
And they'll go in priority top to bottom. So then, you should be like, okay, well, we're going to do these, and you can kind of draw a line and say like, okay, we're going to do these three things as a release because they're going to take the most amount of time or they're going to provide the most value, right?
Right.
You can also see like the other value is that sometimes you can see efficiencies,
Hmm.
right? Like if like let's say they've logged in when they first get to the website, then like, maybe they don't need to put their address in at the end, right? Like and those are the kinds of things that you can visualize on a user story map and say like, okay, well these parts of the and I normally my approach is to reduce the amount of steps that it takes for a person to start and complete the action at the end, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
so as those steps become smaller, right, then you're becoming more efficient, right? Like and I think that usually helps the customer, right?
Yeah.
Like sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes, like you'll get rid of a confirmation or something, right? And then you'll start hearing like, hey, I didn't actually want to delete that, like, and there's no confirmation, and
Yeah.
maybe it makes sense like that, right? Or hey, this person gave a refund to this guy because there's no more confirmation anymore, right? Like, and then you'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, like
Yeah.
let's go back and like put that confirmation back in, or yeah.
Sometimes introducing you is the value, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes
Yeah.
approvals or friction need to be there. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, sometimes too I'll make that like configurable, right? Like where it's like, okay, like if you want a two-step, then we'll add it in, it'll be configurable. But if you don't want like an approval, then we'll just leave it that way, you know?
Yeah. I just
So,
like this is the last question I wanted to touch
sure.
upon the autonomy of the developer. Right now, you've and again, developer very broadly defined. So anybody doing
Sure, sure,
development.
sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
You worked in the waterfall world. You worked in this world. You said that developers need to understand that ultimately that autonomy would be valued by them. Have you seen that transition happen, and how difficult is it for, let's say a junior developer who just wants to know what to do, and
Oh,
nobody
it's very
asking them,
difficult. It's
okay,
very difficult. Yeah, yeah,
right,
yeah. There's always like I said, I think there's even I mean, usually it's met with conflict, right? Like in the sense of like because it's it's definitely not the way most places operate,
Mm,
right? Like and I think ultimately, and like I said, in the short run, it's probably easier just to get the requirements, right?
mm,
Like, and you hear this complaint all the time from developers, like, oh, the meeting, I don't want to be in another meeting, right? Like, but the reality is, like, that's what it's entailing you to do. Either that or think more deeply about the problem from the user's perspective,
yeah.
right? Like, because there's a difference. I think there's a difference in mindset in the sense of like when you're a developer, sometimes you like to think very deeply about the technical problem in the code,
Mm,
right? But I would say that there needs to be more of a focus on the customer and the problems that they'll face
right.
before you get to the code,
Mm,
right? Like and that will ultimately get you a better product than like so you're still doing this deep thinking, right? And this creative thinking, right? Like because there's creative thinking in programming that happens all the time, right?
mm,
Like making things more efficient and whatever, right? Like but now it's really about like the creativity's up to them and you get to kind of decide what are the pieces that I'm going to work at, right? Like, what am I good at? Like, what am I going to realize, like, as I'm going through? Because I'm going to think about this I'm going to think about this deeply as the customer,
yeah.
right? Before I go in and start working on the code. And I would even argue that that will lead to a better outcome because what will happen if you don't, if the developer doesn't do that, right? And just like doesn't really think deeply about the code and goes and does whatever they want, right? Or like whatever they think the assumption is that they think that is to be done.
Yeah.
Then they'll go and they'll code it, and then when they bring it back to me, I'll be like, no, this isn't what I wanted because you didn't think about these like four things, right?
Yeah.
Like that were there. And then they'll have to go back and recode it, right? Like, but by leaving the kind of ambiguity there in the beginning to say, like, no, like you take the time and think about it,
Yeah.
right? Like, think about how you're going to solve this problem. I'm not going to define it for you,
Yeah.
right? Like if you were the user, how would you solve this, right? Like how would you go about doing it?
Yeah.
And I think that makes for a better product in general, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So what's next for you or any parting thoughts?
Uh no, I don't think so. I think yeah, I think that's pretty much it for that. Yeah, again, user story mapping is really good. There is uh some concepts as well. Um, and uh, um, uh, continuous discovery in continuous discovery habits
Mm,
by Teresa Torres. She also has a view on user story mapping, but it's more about opportunity mapping, which I think is also really interesting as
right.
well. And if she has some videos on it as well that are really good. I think she's very good at defining it and walking through that piece of it about opportunity mapping in conjunction with kind of user story mapping. So I think that's also an interesting kind of topic to kind of go deeper into user story mapping. So
Yeah. I'm putting that in my backlist for some kind of a episode on that as well. Awesome. All right,
okay.
Ashish. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.